So welcome everyone to this book launch. So I'm really happy to be the chair to the book launch of Thamy's book called Innovating Democracy, the Means and End of Citizen Participation in Latin America. So for today's event, we have first a presentation of Thamy Pogrebinschi. So Thamy is senior researcher at WZB, Berlin Social Science Center in Berlin, and also faculty member of the Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences at the Humboldt University, also in Berlin. And then Thamy is also the coordinator of the Latino project, the project from which the book comes from. And then we have also Mark, who will discuss Thamy's book during 15 minutes. So Mark is emeritus professor at the University of British Columbia, and is also the president-elect of the American Political Science Association. So for today's book launch, we will first have a 20-minute presentation by Thamy, then a 15-minute discussion by Mark, followed by a quick reaction from Thamy, and then we will open the floor for questions during around 20 minutes. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Thamy.
Thank you, Julien. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm really happy to see all of one here. I'd like to begin by saying big thank you to Participedia and specifically to the research cluster Participatory Governance, also the Center for Deliberative Governance or Deliberative Democracy at the University of Canberra. It's a big joy and pleasure to be able to present my book here today. And so specifically also I would like to thank Vrydagh for having the initiative to organize the launch, and Jesse and Paul for making this happen. Big thanks to Julien for moderating, and special thanks for Mark. And it's such an honor to have him discussing my work here. Let me start telling you something about the context of the book. The book is very little, yeah. It's called also an element because it's a short book, and this was also quite challenging to write it. I would say somehow would have been easier to write something longer than having to write something so short, because it's difficult to make all the empirical data and also to try to make the interpretations and bring the arguments I wanted to advance, having such a limitation, a word limitation that the series requires. So somehow the book presents a lot of things, but cannot go deep on that. And the book, as I think most of people know, it somehow one of the outcomes of my Latino project, which was this project that I coordinated at the Berlin Social Science Center between 2015 and 2021, in which we built the Latino data set, which I guess some of you know. And the book brings the background of the Latino project and data set in a sense, which is the whole conceptual framework, the analytical framework that I designed even a few years later for another research project that later ended up becoming the Latino one, which was precisely based on this pragmatic approach. I mean, by that moment, 2012, 2013, in which I was still working mostly with citizen participation in Brazil, and then broadening my research to Latin America. Then I began thinking on this idea of democratic experimentalism, an idea of a pragmatic democracy to think Latin America based on this idea, or this core idea of the combination or interaction between means and ends, which I think is the core of the book. Is the core also of the data set. Somehow my whole idea since the beginning was trying to see how it would be possible to think democracy in Latin America based on the evidence and not just on normative assumptions, based on this idea of the interaction between the means of participation and the ends of innovations, which basically would then translate as this democratic experimentalism. So I'll speak more about that, but let me share with you my screen. I am not going to show you graphs. I know the book is full of graphs, maybe too much data and too much graphs and tables for such a short book. So I'm not going into the data and into the comparative analysis much today. I will just somehow say a little bit about the context, like going quickly through the main points of some chapters. So let me just share my screen with you. 1 second. So as you can see that, right? Okay, so so let me tell you about the main contributions, which is something, I mean, that I also speak in the introduction. I think there are 3 main contributions maybe that I'm trying to do here, and somehow trying to combine democratic theory and an empirical approach to democratic innovation, specifically to comparative politics and thinking or presenting a comparative analysis of democratic innovations in Latin America. But mainly, I think the core here is this attempt, even in the empirical analysis, to try to advance this pragmatist approach to democratic innovations, which is also problem-driven in the sense that it is based on this idea of the interaction between the means and ends. An initial starting point here was the idea that citizen participation shouldn't be thought of as an end in itself, but that citizen participation was a means to something, and the something, which are then the ends of the innovation, as I call them, are those many qualities of democracy, or the many dimensions of democracy that could be increased through citizen participation. So by observing the innovations in Latin America, and also, of course, by developing a critical approach to the discussion in the field, basically my attempt was to make this claim that, I mean, we're not just thinking of democratic innovation as an attempt to increase citizen participation, to include more citizens. We want to improve democracy, and we want to improve democracy through citizen participation. So for that, it is necessary maybe to separate things and to realize that there are different means through which citizens can participate, and which other authors, even Mark himself, called them maybe functions. And I try to avoid a more functionalist approach, and then this pragmatic approach would be based on this interaction between the diverse means and the ends, which I will talk about more briefly. But this is the main conceptual and theoretical approach that I try to bring, relying, of course, here on the theory of pragmatism, and specifically John Dewey. Now, the book also brings this comparative account of democratic experimentation in Latin America for 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, which is an analysis of the Latino data, trying somehow not only to illustrate some findings and some trends that I hope to highlight some, but specifically it was an attempt to show how, when we look at democratic innovations, trying to understand this interaction between the means and ends, the ends of the innovations, those dimensions of democracy that citizen participation can improve on those new institutional designs, they are related, in fact, to some challenges faced by democracy in Latin America. And so I will call them the deficit of representation, the unrule of law, and inequality. So that's why also the 5 ends, which I will which I will also display briefly, they all related to these challenges. So the ends of the democratic innovations are accountability and responsiveness, which is could improve the justice of representation, strengthening the rule of law, which would address problems within the rule of law, and inequality would then be addressed by political inclusion and social equality as being some important ends of democratic innovations too. Now, the third contribution, which I hope to do, is this typology of democratic innovations. There are other typologies and very good ones done by colleagues and which had been discussed over the last years too. But my attempt here was trying to do it not only based on evidence from case studies or from literature review, but using this large data set, which includes cases from national and subnational level from 18 countries across a period of 30 years. So briefly, this is the data of the Latino data set, which is on chapter 2 then, which is called the empirical landscape. I illustrate briefly, explaining also the methodology behind the data set, some methodological options that had to be made, and then showing some evolutions, which I believe are important, of democratic innovation in Latin America throughout these 30 years, specifically also identifying some factors which I believe have enabled citizen participation in Latin America. I'm not going through this now, but I talk about democratization, constitutionalization, or this lawmaking as factors that enabled more democratic innovations, the left turn, the decentralization processes, and the digitalization. So all of them sometimes also overlap during some periods, and analyzing the data reveals also some interesting trends with the data, which I'm not going to show deeply here. There's no time for that, but I will come back to them at the end. Now, briefly about the third chapter, section, which is properly this more pragmatist approach, in which I discussed a bit the concept of democratic innovations, departing from the most acknowledged or accepted definition of democratic innovation to claim then basically 4 things. Well, the first is this idea of participation not as an end in itself, but as a means to enhance democracy through 5 ends. I will talk more about the means and ends in the next slide. Another point is also thinking the democratic innovations not only as institutions. Yeah, we for a long time have talked about democratic innovations that are institutions that have been specifically designed to increase citizen participation. And then I try also to systematize here, based on the data, the innovations in institutions, processes, and mechanisms, and showing the difference between those 3 kinds of democratic innovations. And this is part of the definition that I claim, which is precisely this: innovations are institutions, processes, and mechanisms, and is to enhance democracy by means of citizen participation in at least one stage of the policy cycle. The policy cycle then is the third of the main points that I try to do in this third chapter, which is the idea that there are 4 main moments of innovation. There are 4 main moments where citizen participation can take place in a democratic innovation, and those moments are those from the policy process. I mean, agenda setting, policy formulation, implementation, or evaluation. Because also the data that I'm analyzing is data that have been only included in data set because they could, in fact, impact in one of the stages of the policy cycle. This is also explained in the more methodological part. So one idea here was precisely showing, okay, we have to go beyond the fact that democratic innovations, they impact only on decision making, or the citizens should participate only in decision making. This is important, and that is decision also involved in the other stages of the policy cycle. But it's not only about doing policies. Citizens can also participate before policies are formulated and after policies are formulated, and this is also very relevant for democratic innovation. And the fourth point, which I think is quite important, and it's something that I'm working right now more further on is the fact that innovation is something beyond the state. I mean, also, if we look not only to the conceptual discussion on democratic innovations, but also to case studies. I mean, mostly we look at forms or new institutional designs that have been designed and implemented by the state, by governments. And so, especially in Latin America, this has been very strong to think on democratic innovations as being something that was originated from and supported from and implemented by governments. And then in the book, I try to show how civil society, especially, but also non-state actors like international organizations and private stakeholders, they also drive innovations. Then briefly here, I spoke a lot about the means and ends already, but just to show this framework, more or less, I mean, the interaction between means and end would be this interaction between four means of participation, which is deliberation, citizen representation, digital engagement, and direct voting. I won't explain it in the book. And then the five means, which I already mentioned, and which I try to make them correspond to different dimensions of the quality of democracy, because I think it's important that we make these movements from democratic theory to comparative politics, from the field of democratic innovations to the one that studies the quality of democracy, if we want to give a step further and really be able to see the impact of democratic innovations on democracy. So this we can discuss also further, but I will speed up a little bit now because I don't want to run out of time. Now, this on chapter 4, which addresses the means of citizen participation, then I present this typology of democratic innovations. So the whole idea here, what I do is first also define the four means: deliberation, citizen representation, digital engagement, direct voting. And then bring about the main institutional designs, remembering here that they are institutions, processes, and mechanisms. In some cases, you have all three in one of these subtypes of democratic innovations, but sometimes we will have more than one or only one. Like, for example, the designs corresponding to digital engagement, you will mostly have what I call mechanisms, sometimes processes. And deliberation, we will have also mostly sometimes properly institutions, but not only, also processes many times. So, but those are families, right? I don't want to call them families. I like to think on these categories as a data container, which is a definition from Giovanni Sartori, which is explained in the book. So the idea is precisely here that they are empirical facts that can be conceptualized, and those have been constructed based on the empirical evidence. And of course, there is a lot of diversity among designs that can contain in each of these sub-kinds of innovations. And they are very diverse across countries, of course, and also within countries sometimes. But mostly we can identify those subtypes of innovations here. And the importance of looking at that, I think I will speak briefly when I come to the conclusion. Now, I won't spend much time here in the explaining what I bring in the fifth chapter, which is the ends of innovations, where I try then to explain a little bit more this pragmatic approach, like showing how democratic innovations can combine, how means interact with each other, and how means and ends also interact with one another, and how you have most of the times more than one means of participation, and also how democratic innovations, they aim also at different things, which leads to innovations having different ends, which is something that we coded also at the Latino data set. And it's very clearly by analyzing the data how we can then identify some interactions, I mean, which are more frequent among means and among ends in certain situations. And then what I did here in this analysis was identifying the main problems that innovations are trying to address. to improve then accountability, for example, to improve responsiveness, and each of the 5 N's. And then I classify somehow the diverse aims that democratic innovations can have. So, and then I will do it for each of the 5 N's, which you can hopefully see in the book. And then I will just come now to my last slide, because I think this is the most important thing maybe that I would like to discuss and talk about, hoping that you can all read the book, because I will never be able to in 20 minutes go in detail on each of the chapters and everything. But the way I see it, when I look to what I did, I think that there are some lessons that I learned myself. I mean, looking into this whole data, 30 years of data, and I've been working with that for, I mean, throughout this time. Initially, also when I still was in Brazil, and also working more closely and qualitatively to some democratic innovations, and later doing this comparative project, and then looking to the whole data and analyzing that for the book. Some things are, for me now, important to think about, not only looking backwards to what happened in the last 30 years of democratic innovation in Latin America, but thinking on what is going on now also in the field of democratic innovations, and how we can think on them for the future. So one thing that I think, I mean, these points are somehow scattered, even if not in detail, discussed in the last chapter, in the conclusion. But if I could summarize here 5 points or conclusions, would be, the first is the democratic innovations, they need to, and they are moving beyond deliberation. This is something that I show in chapter 2 also with the data, how in Latin America we can see deliberation declining after 2015 and digital innovations increasing since 2010, but especially after 2015, and I explained that and analyzed that. But I think that's important to think now beyond Latin America, because we're precisely on a moment, or coming from a few years in which the field is predominated by studies of deliberation and mini publics and citizens assembly, and now this trend to implement that as it was maybe the only game in town, the only institutional design possible, just like it was done with the participatory budget like 20 years ago. And then I hope that the book can show, well, there are hundreds of design for citizen participation. And probably also there are much more in other countries and other regions, and not only in Latin America. But I mean, it makes sense that it's important to look for them and to study them and to understand them and try to learn from them, and not just stick to one same institutional design, as it would be the solution for everything, and also for discussing every possible problem and policy. So the other point regarding this move beyond deliberation would be the importance, I think, of thinking on the interaction among diverse means and ends. I mean, this combination of designs. If we want to address public problems with democratic innovations, if we want democratic innovations to improve democracy, then we have to go beyond deliberation in the sense of thinking how the diverse means of participation can work together, and they definitely do. It's not just deliberation and digital participation. And also, how can we combine different institutional designs and think on them in a way in which we can definitely have more effectiveness and more impact. I'll finish soon. So the importance of moving beyond the state also, yeah, I think it's very important that we look to civil society, to what civil society has been doing in terms of democratic innovation, also other non-state actors. Now that we have more and more digital innovations, other non-state actors become more important. I mean, Latin America, they had a role in other periods, like international organizations. Now we see also even private stakeholders growing, as they can also somehow offer resources, but also the technology which is necessary to develop some democratic innovation. And so we have to look at that to understand what democratic innovations is today, and is becoming now and will become in the future, I think. And acknowledging the role of civil society, I think, is extremely important. I mean, Latin America definitely is very associated with the process of democratization. It must be associated with the process of consolidation of democracy. But I think beyond Latin America too, I mean, we can give a step further in our field if we also acknowledge civil society as not just they are the practitioners who are implementing the design that we're thinking about here, but people are developing things. We have to see what they're doing and understand what they're doing, and not just the other way around. One point I make at the end, which is quite strong based on my analysis of the data, is how this rise of civil society and of digital participation, which I show how it's been increasing a lot in Latin America over the last years, this is definitely changing the scenario, the landscape of a democratic innovation. It is changing in Latin America. I will dare to say without the data that also beyond Latin America, but I think the important thing for us all here beyond Latin America is how that may require us to revisit concept and praxis that we have. I mean, the concept we've been using of democratic innovations, of participation. What is participation today? We definitely need to reconsider in face of how digitalization is more and more a reality. Now, the idea of moving beyond decision making, I spoke about that already somehow. I think the discussion on the impact is an important one in our field. Yeah, it's something that we need to have more studies of impact. We need to have more comparative studies, more large-end studies, to be able to properly understand the impact of democratic innovations. But I think it's also important that we acknowledge that democratic innovations, they comprise and all stages of the policy cycle, and then the citizen participation may happen in all of those stages. And it's important not only in decision making, not only when democratic innovations come up with a policy, because many of them are not intended to, are not designed to have a policy at the end. So we have to acknowledge all that, also to properly assess the impact of democratic innovation. And finally, how can we make democratic innovation stronger? In the last chapter, in the conclusion, I tell this Brazil tale, this cautionary tale about Brazil, all what happened. We had this huge architecture of citizen participation. Brazil was a laboratory. Everybody was looking to Brazil when talking about citizen participation for many years. And then, as you know, come Bolsonaro and just ended up with most of it, or almost everything, in one single moment with a single act. I mean, it's much more complex than that. But what can we learn from that? Looking to what existed before and then after. So what I claim is that it's really important that we have here the presence of civil society, not only participating in the innovation, but really implementing them together with the government, when government is the one doing that. We need formalization, which does not necessarily imply an institutionalization. The digital innovations, they're not necessarily institutions, but they can be formalized somehow. It is important to have binding decisions for those innovations that take decisions, but how to make results which are not decisions also be binding. And lastly, the impact. I mean, thinking on the impact is important when thinking on the design. And so the combination of those four elements, I think, are what can make the designs stronger, participatory institutions, strong institutions. Well, I'll finish now. The last point would be about how to think further on digital participation for the future. But I think I also somehow said some words about that, and I'm pretty much beyond my time. I apologize, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Thamy. So it was also my responsibility to keep time, but the end was so interesting that I didn't want to interrupt. So now we will have Mark for the discussion of the book. Mark, you have 15 minutes.
Good. Well, thank you, Julien. Thank you, Thamy. Thank you, Paul and Jesse, for organizing and hosting this event. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So I'm really pleased and honored to comment on Thamy's new book, which is marks a huge leap forward in the comparative study of democratic innovations. I want to emphasize at the outset just how ambitious, both theoretically and empirically, this project was. We just at this point, don't have any other systematic examples of this kind of work in the field of democratic innovations. And the reason is that this is just really difficult, resource-intensive work. And Thamy has just taken on a huge project here and followed it through with stubbornness and determination and brilliance. But also hats off to the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin for recognizing this project and providing Thamy with the resources to follow through and complete it. Besides documenting the landscape of democratic innovations in Latin America, the strength of the project is its careful, empirically attentive use of democratic theory to develop middle-level theory, connecting democratic ideals and norms to empirics, that is, to this enormously rich set of cases. And this is where I'm going to focus my comments. It's going to be a little bit of repetition of what Thamy said, but maybe in slightly different words. Let me start with the normative project. Thamy follows a problem-driven, or maybe in slightly other language, problem-based approach to democratic theory. The general idea here is that democratic theory should identify democratic deficits, especially those that have some purchase on norms that are already embedded in political systems and political cultures. These comprise the democratic problems or challenges for the political system. In Latin America, these problems are, include unequal representation, weak rule of law, corruption, poor accountability, social and political inequality, and so on. These kinds of problems can be identified both empirically and normatively. The empirics are pretty well known, and they show up in a variety of democracy indicators and indexes, which can, of course, be refined to identify challenges that are unique to specific countries. Ecuador versus Brazil, Brazil versus Guatemala, and so on. Normatively, Thamy argues that the deficits can be restated as compromised norms of accountability, responsiveness, rule of law, social equality, and political inclusion. These are norms that roughly overlap with those common in democratic theory and comparative democratization projects. We can then ask whether a specific democratic innovation contributes to solving one or more of these problems. So in this way, Thamy drives the project with normative questions, but questions that, on the one hand, can be refined to fit their manifestations within specific contexts. On the other hand, helps to differentiate what is in fact the case. No one kind of democratic innovation can solve all the problems of democracy. Rather, democratic innovations should be seen as targeting specific problems like social inequality and should be normatively assessed in their contributions to solving a democracy-relevant problem. Now, in using this strategy, Thamy is suggesting that we should be normatively precise, assessing the democratic innovation according to the problems it purports to address, but also normatively demanding in that the adjective democratic needs to have content. Just because, say, advocates or organizers, sponsors, governments call a process democratic doesn't make it so. We find a lot of what we're coming to call democracy washing, analogous to greenwashing in this area. So we need to stand back and ask whether the innovation is contributing to one or more of these 5 dimensions of democracy, which is what Thamy does in the last sections of the book, applying these criteria to each category of democratic innovation. Now, the second theoretical problem is one that we've tried to develop in Participedia, namely developing a typology of democratic innovations that makes sense of an often bewildering landscape of potentially democratic political processes. A typology should, of course, be driven by the normative problems of democracy. It should be economical enough to provide a comparative analysis for purposes of assessment, learning, and inspiration, and still fine-grained enough to categorize empirical cases. Thamy's strategy, as you've been hearing, is first to define what counts as a democratic innovation, thus identifying the boundaries of the typology. She defines democratic innovations as institutions, processes, and mechanisms whose end is to enhance democracy by means of citizen participation in at least one stage of the policy cycle. This was a quote from Thamy's book. Note, again, that the normative definitions develop the scope and lead the typology. The democratic innovation must enhance democracy. Now, second, Thamy distinguishes between means of participation and democratic ends, which is core to her comments just now. Now, the point here is that many kinds of participation don't enhance democracy at all. Clientelist systems with long histories in Latin America often have high levels of participation, but the participation is integrated into clientelist and often authoritarian organizations. So Thamy does the smart thing, which is to identify the ways in which citizens might participate, and then ask how these kinds of participation might contribute to democracy, in both theoretically and in the cases she has collected and investigated. She distinguishes 4 ways, or what she calls means, ways and means of participation: deliberation, representation, digital engagement, and direct voting. A third, Thamy loosens the temporal definitions of what can count as democratic influence. So influence is important not just at sites of decision-making, but also in agenda setting, policy formation, implementation, and evaluation. Some of these points have long been emphasized by democratic theorists. Dahl has famously emphasized, for example, the importance of citizen control over agenda setting. Many democratic innovations, especially those that are initiated by civil society organizations, have their greatest impact in setting agendas or monitoring policies that have already been decided or implemented. What we get is a normatively driven but empirically attentive typology that covers pretty much everything that we would want to count intuitively as a participatory democratic innovation, not just in Latin America, but around the world as well. The overall picture is one which we can see very rich landscapes of places and sites of democratic participation. Stepping back, we can see that some of the older pictures of political systems becoming increasingly dominated by political and technocratic elites may not be the future after all. In Latin America, the divergence between these two pictures is quite striking. Latin American elites, of course, do not have a good history of working for the people. And so it's been up to the people to push for more responsiveness, less corruption, more equality, more efficiency in delivering services, and so on. The first stop for citizens is, again, empirically, and I think historically, not democratic innovations, because the innovations are quite scarce, but rather protest, demonstration, resistance. It's the second stop that Thamy is documenting now. This is the landscape of democratic innovations that have emerged in part in response to these forms of citizen resistance. And what the innovations do is potentially transform democratic resistance into democratic governance. Now, a few other thoughts, mostly focused on future research agendas. First, Thamy's theoretical strategy is focused on mapping the kinds of democratic innovations in Latin America. For this reason, her data set is designed to sample these kinds rather than to sample the universe of democratic innovations. To do this, she selected cases, as we would say in political science research design, she selected cases on the dependent variables. that is, for their contributions to one or more dimensions of democracy. Now, this is exactly the right way to go when you're building empirically attentive middle-level theory. But as Thamy notes, there are tens of thousands, maybe more than tens of thousands of cases in Latin America alone of democratic innovations. And so a next stage of research needs a slightly different strategy to figure out where democratic innovations are, to reflect their densities, especially in places, levels of government, areas of policy, and so on. Second, while Thamy is able to trace some of the impacts of democratic innovations on 5 key dimensions of democracy, that is, accountability, responsiveness, rule of law, social equality, and political inclusion, it's a much harder job to figure out what the aggregate effects of democratic innovations are on democratizing political systems. This is ultimately what we want to know, but it's also a really tough kind of research to do, especially if we want to draw causal inferences between democratic innovations and democratization. A halfway point in democratic theory will be to think about democratic systems. That is, the ways in which democratic innovations complement one another and perhaps supplement the legacy institutions of representative democracy to advance the democratic project. Third, Thamy ends her book with a pressing question, which she mentioned in her comments. Why was Bolsonaro able to roll right over Brazil's strong legacy of democratic innovations and push the country back toward authoritarianism? She offers a number of quite plausible reasons, including the high dependence of democratic innovations on the state, weak institutionalization, weak relationships to sites of decision-making power. We need to, but stepping back from this, we need to keep the Brazil question in the foreground. What would it take to future-proof democratic political systems from authoritarian backsliding? What kinds of defensive roles might democratic innovations play? Finally, Thamy stipulates by definition that democratic innovations involve citizen participation. Now, I think this stipulation is fine for theory building in the area of participatory democracy. But there are many innovations that benefit democracy, but with little citizen participation, at least in a direct and ongoing way. Examples would be conflict of interest rules for office holders, oversight and auditing of budgets, electoral reforms that provide for better representation. Now, of course, many of these things aren't really innovations. We know what they look like and we've seen them before, but they would be innovations if they were exported from the countries that have perfected them into countries that have not. Still, we may want a more permissive set of boundaries for the term democratic innovations so that we can capture everything that's innovative and benefits the democratic project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Thamy. Thamy, you have like maximum 5 minutes for a reaction.
Well, I think I could just like thank you, Mark, for the 5 minutes. No, it's just great. I don't think I mean, I will respond to, I mean, it's so much what he said that is also, it was interesting to listen about my own work and realize that things like, for example, how I was much more normative than I was thinking I was, somehow true. I mean, this is, it's interesting to realize, and also the limits also of the data and how looking to Latin America to think beyond that and to think the future research. And I don't think I should take time to respond specifically because I know I spoke more than I should at the beginning, and I know we have to finish in like 13 minutes. So I would just say like huge thank you, Mark. It's such a privilege and an honor to have this amazing opportunity to listen to your comment on the book, and I know, I hope, and I know, I mean, that we will be all able to keep this conversation further, but I will then allow the other people now to say something, because I know we're beyond time, and because I know I will never be able to respond in 5 minutes. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Thamy. So now I will open the Q&A. So if you have a question, you can just like click on reactions and raise your hand. And then I guess everyone is a bit shy to break the ice. You can also write your question in the chat if you prefer. So we have some people thanking you for the presentation, but we have a question from Yassir. So Yassir, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question or write it in the chat.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. Thank you, Thamy, for your book and for the presentation. Thank you, Julien. I have a quick question, Thamy, about the place of online deliberation, and how do you see the future of online platforms for online deliberation vis-a-vis face-to-face deliberation modalities? In the sense that how can the design of such platforms, digital platforms, how should it be from your experience? How should it be carried out? How should it be closer to the input of the end target of end users, the citizens? So the question here is basically about the design maybe of online deliberation digital platforms and how you see it from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Now, institutional design is not something that I address specifically in the book, in the sense of trying to make recommendations for specific design. So I'm going to give you a more general answer based on what I learned from the cases. Yeah. And from observation. I mean, the first thing is, I think, to improve institutional design for online deliberation, we have to approach the idea of deliberation more pragmatically to begin with, and less normatively, because and in general, this is something that democratic in Latin America taught me about. I mean, even when I was trying to construct more empirical concepts and ended up making them more normative than I thought, but Mark showed me somehow now. Even though what I think the democratic innovations in Latin America show is how you can effectively have citizen participation and recognize it if without trying to make practices fit concepts. And deliberation is the most normative one we do have. And I think to the extent that we try to stick to all the normative presuppositions and the criteria and the requirements necessary to have real deliberation, especially online, which is so challenging without being able to do that face-to-face, even not face-to-face in digital platforms, yeah, but really having to change the means in the design to combine deliberation and digital participation. I think it's totally necessary to understand deliberation in the most minimalist way possible. I mean, there should be definitely minimal interaction among people, but we do need to maybe here relax some criteria in order to accomplish an exchange, in order that there is interaction, there is different point of view, there is somehow some weighting, right, of things, but without necessarily overriding sometimes institutional designs, because we cannot live up to the normative criteria of deliberation. So I honestly think that designs in which people can simply voice, and then express through writing without a real dynamic simultaneous exchange with other people. But for example, even in process of crowdsourcing legislation and crowdsourcing policy, you have here means in which people can add arguments, they can refute arguments, they can make proposals, even if not directly to others in that moment, but still I think that should count, and that do count of deliberation. So I think, for example, in crowdsourced legislation, crowdsourced policies, in which we have some cases in Latin America, we can count that as deliberation, and should somehow, because this is the future. I think we will have more and more of that. And I think the important here is to be able not to think, for example, in crowdsourced processes as being something which is digital participation, which is not like real participation. There's no way deliberation. Now, how can we also somehow consider that deliberation, trying to somehow be approach deliberation more pragmatically and less normatively, in the sense of enabling sometimes the interaction also not to be simultaneous and not only face-to-face, and so on. Anyway, so other people want to talk. I won't continue, but that's what I would say for now. Thanks for your question.
Okay, so before I leave the word to Juan and Tiago, I have two questions in the chat. The first one is from Gonzalo Galindo Delgado, and it's: how would you characterize, Thamy, the relationship between the peak tide or the left-leaning governments in Latin America with democratic innovations? Is there any specificity in the way these progressive governments face the issue of democratic innovation? So that's question one. And I propose that we also take the second question, which is from Baogang. And he's wondering why you do not include some local participation in Cuba.
So I will start with Baogang question, because that's a quick. So in the book, I analyzed the data from the Latino data set. And in the Latino project, the initial idea was including Cuba, indeed, but we simply couldn't, because we couldn't find enough information. It was very difficult to have access to information. And so we couldn't simply also try to get whatever we could, because we would have here an imbalanced amount of evidence in comparison to the other countries. I mean, so basically it was lack of data, and lack of possibility also to get access to the data, which led to the decision to leave Cuba and IT also outside of the data set. But initially the idea would be having 20 countries and not 18. Now, the question about the left turn, or the pink tide, this is analyzed in chapter 2, in the empirical landscape, and I show there how the left turn is one of the enabling factors of the development of democratic innovations in Latin America. And there are interesting findings there, looking to the data. I see, well, first, well, one thing that's important to say is that democratic innovation in Latin America is not just a result of left-leaning governments, which is something that for a while was also many times supposed. I mean, this direct association was done. There was a huge investment on citizen participation by left-leaning governments, and we can see that in the data, especially at the national level. So this is one thing that the democratic innovations own to left-leaning governments in Latin America, which is bringing citizen participation to the national level. So the number of national level designs really increased during the left turn period, and also deliberation. You can definitely identify the rise of deliberation and with the left-leaning government. So during the left turn, deliberation was massively the main means of participation used in democratic innovation. I mean, overall, it was always deliberation, but it has been increased. It has increased a lot during the left turn, and it has decreased considerably. I mean, really impressively after the end of the left turn, if we can call that way, but somehow try to identify right around 2015. So when the left hand recedes, and then deliberation also recedes. But then also we do have more authoritarianism growing in some countries here, which would also somehow also lead to this decrease of deliberation. So basically, I would say two main features would be national level citizen participation, national level democratic innovations, and deliberation as being the two major characteristics of democratic innovations during the last term. Not only, but the mainly.
Thank you, Thamy. So we have 3 minutes left. So I propose we take the 2 questions from Juan Carlo and Tiago. Sorry, Juan Carlo was first. Please go ahead, Juan.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Thamy, for very inspiring work and for the book. I just have a question about how would you like to say that, like, maybe what are the knowledge about how is the best ways to design democratic innovation to impact policy making, and not only in the agenda setting stage, but also the formulation, to the implementation, and then the evaluation of policies, how to create such a collaborative setting or governance that embeds participatory processes into the policy making.
Thank you, Juan Carlos.
I had, we're going to check first, and I just had some trouble to understand your question. Sorry, because there was a bit of a echo here for me. If you could just rephrase again your question, Juan Carlos, before we move to Thiago.
Yeah. So I was saying that the question is about like how to impact, how would democratic innovation would impact policy making, and what are the insights like maybe you would present in the book that are the best ways to embed participatory processes into the policy, not only in the agenda setting stage, but also like through the formulation, implementation, and the evaluation processes. If like.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And then we have Tiago.
Yeah, hi, Thamy. Mine is not a theoretical question. It's more like kind of like how the sausage was made. I know that you had an army of RAs working on this project, and I just wanted to hear from you like how you, like what you learned through this entire process, and particularly in terms of like processes that you built to ensure that the data collection was like high quality and uniform across the RAs. How the data collection was actually made with this huge number of RAs that you had working on this huge data collection process, and also like in terms of like intercoder reliability, how you measure that, if you had like a process to measure that. So was more like, I imagine that that's not on the book because that's probably like a huge appendix. So I was just like curious to hear your experience like with this like huge data collection effort.
So Chad was asking this question, but he was one of the 32 research assistants of the Latino project. And I cannot say here that he was also my best PhD student ever, because the other can get jealous. But as he has 2 PhDs, then maybe I can say that. So I'll begin with that. I mean, so well, first, the book is not just like a summary of the Latino data, yeah, of the Latino project. I think actually, I mean, the data somehow serves more in the data analysis and the comparative analysis also to illustrate. I think this is the way I see it. That's more also the entire approach, or this attempt to have this pragmatic approach to democratic innovations. Now, it's very difficult to deal with large and data, you know that better than I do. It's extremely challenging. I mean, the entire project was challenging. We had to do like several methodological decisions throughout the way. I mean, it's very complicated also to coordinate. There's 32 people involved with that, 18 countries, and different stages of the project also involving different groups of people, not always also the same group. Some people stayed very briefly, some people stayed longer. Regarding intercoder reliability, we did some tests in different moments in the 2 stages of the project with different groups of coders. And we had good results, not exceptional, but we had good results. And as you know, but I may say that this is described actually briefly in the book, in the first part of the second chapter, which how there was this attempt to prepare the coders also to be able to collect the data based on one same procedure, and also then to code it, and also the understanding of the categories and everything. Now, a huge challenge has been the missing data. There's of course a lot of missing data, and especially when it comes to the third group of variables, the impact variables, and there it was really, really difficult. Also, the context variables is when we tried also to collect data on the ideology of the political parties using another data set, but then it's difficult to find data on local, at the local level. It's easier to find at the national level. One lesson is regarding data on impact, which I think is important for everyone, is we don't have to produce more data on the impact of innovations, because, and this is something my friend Matt Ryan have been saying for years. I mean, the data we have tend to successful cases. We have much more evidence on successful cases. So this bias the data, of course, and we clearly can see that with the Latino data as well. We have about 1/3 of cases with complete data for the impact variables. And most of them are positive in the sense because we only have evidence for successful, not only, but mostly for successful cases. So it's very important to produce research on the impact of innovations. Now, I won't go in more detail, but it is explained in the first part of the second chapter for those who want to read it. The question from one, if I could then listen it correctly, about the impact on policy making. Yeah. So the attempt of measuring and evaluating, of course, is much easier to see. Agenda setting and policy formulation are more clearly and straightforward somehow to analyze the impact. But it's also possible to see it for the implementation and evaluation, because we had previously also the coding of those innovations acting on those stages. And then we found the evidence or not showing that the innovation had, and then it's important here to think on the impact variables that we had in the data set. I mean, if they achieve the aim, so our innovations have besides the end an aim. So let's say I'll take the easiest example, the participatory budgeting. Participatory budget, the aim would be to do that public budget with citizen participation. And was the budget then finalized, and it came out, there was effectively at the end a budget with citizen participation. The aim was fulfilled, and to what extent? And there was an output, something come out of that, a kind of decision. I mean, depends on the innovation. Some decisions, some are not decisions. Some are real policies because they want to set the agenda or to formulate a policy specifically. But some are like reports, for example, regarding innovations that aim at accountability. And there had been an outcome if the output was a policy, if the innovation aimed at a policy, this policy was then enacted or implemented. There was evidence for that, and what the evidence showed. So it was like totally fully enacted the policy. And so this is a way of looking at that too. And the ends of the innovations is the most tricky one, which is trying to measure whether there had been some impact on the dimensions of the quality of democracy, on the 5 ends, and accountability and social equality. And for that, the coders had to rely on the evidence available and to do an assessment based on the criteria we had to assess this impact, to find or not, right, this evidence of impact, and to what extent. It was like a total impact, positive, or it was partial impact on the end. So it's very tricky and difficult, and of course the data has lots of limitations, yeah, also because there's a huge effort of the team, a lot of people throughout a long time. So I think throughout the time we try to do the best, but as in all data sets, there is a lot of limitations. I mean, also regarding the methodological decision was necessary, and also with the results. I mean, still today, when I'm using the data for other purposes, sometimes I look and I think, I find things that I wish that could have been different, but it will be always like that, and this is just impossible in this huge, right? So I think, and I hope that my team and I, that we try to deliver the best, and that can be also useful for other people, not only for this book.
Great, thank you very much, Thamy. So it's past 5 at least here in Brussels. So I think it's time to conclude. I want to thank Thamy and Mark for the discussion and all the people in the audience for the questions. And I also want to thank Friedel Marker from Canberra, Paul and Jesse for helping organizing this book launch. So I wish you a nice day, a nice evening, or nice Feierabend if you are in Europe. Thank you very much for being there.
Thank you,
everyone.
If I may just say thank you again for everyone, for the organizers at Participedia. Big thank you. Thank you, Julien, for moderating. Mark, huge thank you. And thanks to everyone that is here from everywhere at different times. And it was great. Thanks a lot.
All right, everyone.